Alright ladies, this screencast is going to start kind of in the middle of the Sacco and Vanzetti case. So depending on where your class ended things on Monday, you can just fast forward as needed, okay? So as we described, Sacco and Vanzetti were both Italian immigrants who were arrested for a crime, robbery and murder. They were charged with those two crimes. And the main evidence was that witnesses at the scene claimed that the two criminals appeared to be Italian. When the trial went to court, pretty much all of the evidence against Sacco and Vanzetti was circumstantial, meaning nothing really objectively proved that they did it, without a doubt. Also, the two men asserted their innocence and also provided alibis. An alibi is basically some sort of proof that you were somewhere else when the crime was committed, so you couldn't have done it. Regardless of this evidence that they provided, both men were convicted and found guilty and sentenced to death. And this is going to spark a series of protests, not just in the United States, but also really across the world, just because people see the kind of hysterical and radical results of Nativism in the United States. Regardless of if they did it or not, it wasn't proven that they did it in the case. So for them to be sentenced to death was just very, very extreme. These are some of the pictures of the protests I'm talking about. And then I have a quote from one of the men, Vanzetti. You don't have to memorize it at all, but it's just kind of interesting to consider. In all my life, I have never stole, never killed, never spilled blood. We were tried during a time when there was hysteria of resentment and hate against the people of our principles, against the foreigner. I am suffering because I am a radical, and indeed I am a radical. I have suffered because I was an Italian, and indeed I am an Italian. If you could execute me 2 times, and if I could be reborn 2 other times, I would live again to do what I have done already. This is just kind of, Vanzetti saying and asserting that the reason I've been convicted is just because of my radical beliefs and my immigrant status, not because I actually did anything wrong. Now, in a plot twist, several decades later, after both of the men had been executed, forensic testing did kind of prove that the gun that was found at the murder scene was Sacco's gun. But there's no actual proof that he was the one to pull the trigger. So, again, regardless of if they completed the crime or not, the real true point here is that they were only really convicted because of people not liking them. Kind of continuing on this idea of people and Americans being anti-immigrant at this point, many Americans kind of started speaking out against immigrants in general, saying that caps should be placed on immigrants, basically preventing, numbers of immigrants from coming into the United States. And Congress is going to pass what is called the Emergency Quota Act of 1921, which a quota can either be a minimum or a maximum number, but in this case, it's going to place a maximum number on the number of immigrants who could come into the United States from a specific country. So different countries were given different quotas in terms of how many immigrants could come from that particular country into the United States in a given year. And obviously, this allowed the U.S. government to further stereotype countries that they particularly disliked, mainly in Southern and Eastern Europe, like Italy, the Soviet Union. Those countries would have lower numbers than countries such as the United Kingdom or Britain. Alright, we're going to talk about our first president of the unit, and that is going to be President Warren G. Harding. He is pictured on the screen. He was a Republican, and we're going to look at first just an event or one main event that occurs during his presidency before we talk about anything specifically having to do with him or his cabinet. So I'm seeing it's just a tad cut off here. I'm seeing if I can adjust that a little bit. If you kind of recall from our World War I unit, money was the U.S.'s biggest contribution to the Allies' effort. We had loaned England and France a large amount of money, particularly specifically here, $10 billion, to help them maintain their resources to keep the fighting up during the war. And we're ready to have that money back. They have not begun to pay us back any of the money they owe us because they really aren't doing that great economically. We're not doing so great economically. Imagine how they're doing. The country, those countries actually hosted the war. So by hosting, I just mean the war was fought in their countries. So they're a little bit even more economically devastated than we were during World War I. So they certainly don't have the financial means to be paying us back right now. But if you kind of also recall from our World War I unit, Germany actually is supposed to be paying England and France money because, according to the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was the main instigator in the war, so they owed quote-unquote war damages, war reparations to the Allies in Europe. So Germany is supposed to be paying England and France. England and France are supposed to be paying us, but no one's really paying anyone because just like England and France can't afford to pay us back, Germany can't afford to pay England and France back. So basically the U.S. wants to kind of remedy this situation, and you're going to see that the plan that is kind of invented, quite frankly, is a bad plan. It's essentially going to be the Jay's Treaty of this semester. It involves the American investment banker named Charles Dawes. He's going to be sent to Europe to negotiate some sort of solution to this kind of financial crisis. And what's essentially going to be created is called the Dawes Plan, named after him. And here's what the Dawes Plan involved. U.S. investors would loan Germany money that was to eventually be paid back to us. And then Germany will use some of those funds to pay back England and France. And then England and France will use some of those funds to pay back us. So it kind of seems like the money is just coming full circle and that we're actually just paying ourselves back because we loaned this money to Germany in the first place. It's getting paid right back to us. Which is true, but just to kind of clear that up a little bit, because it does sound rough, and it is rough, and it doesn't go well, because it would have to work perfectly to go well. But essentially, Dawes' thinking is that he will just jumpstart the economy in Europe here with this plan, and that once Germany starts making money, then the money will flow naturally between all the three countries, and eventually Germany would pay us back as well, so that we would get our money back. But unfortunately, that's not going to really happen because, World War II is going to be coming around the corner. So while it was kind of a rough plan on paper, and unfortunately is executed in a rough way as well, and this really isn't going to result in much happy feelings from anyone involved. Okay, I want to pick up now with President Harding's friends and his choice in friends and how his choice of friends is actually pretty poor. Pretty much his cabinet is made up of his friends from his home state of Ohio. They are politicians, but they're not the best people, and they make some pretty immoral and corrupt decisions while in office, and they kind of create a lot of scandal and get Harding himself into a little bit of public opinion trouble. So I'm going to give you one example, and his friends, by the way, and his cabinet is nicknamed the Ohio Gang. So you need to know that name. The Ohio Gang describes Harding's cabinet. We're going to just get into one example of scandal in the White House, and in the White House administration, and that is the Teapot Dome scandal. First, let me just say that Teapot Dome describes a location in Wyoming, in the state of Wyoming, so it's not have anything to do with a teapot or tea time. It's a location in Wyoming. Probably the biggest example of corruption in his cabinet. So it involves his Secretary of Interior, Albert Fall. And you don't need to know this, but just in case you're confused, the Secretary of Interior, the Department of Interior, deals with ownership of U.S. territories around the country and world. So you'll see why this would have something to do with his position. But anyway, so Albert Fall, his friend, one of the Ohio gang members, and his Secretary of Interior. Now, where Teapot Dome comes into play here, there was oil-rich land in Teapot Dome, Wyoming. And the United States had set aside that land for the Navy. So oil is a natural resource, a very wealthy resource at this point in history, and even today presently. If it's set aside for the Navy, what that means is that the Navy will use that land, and any profits that are to be made off that land, the Navy gets to keep those profits. Albert Fall is going to find out about this land. He is going to have the land transferred out of the Navy's control and into his Department of Interior control. And then he begins secretly leasing the land to private U.S. oil companies. So U.S. oil companies are now being allowed to come refine the oil in this land in Wyoming and profit off of it. And in return, they pay Albert Fall directly. So he's basically being paid to let the oil companies use this land for their own profit, and then he's making a profit off of that. And this is called bribery. So this is a felony and not a good thing. And he did it, behind the president's back, but it still makes the president look pretty bad. And Robert Fall will be removed from office during this time. Unfortunately, Harding's, stress levels, probably because of his choice in friends in his cabinet, are going to cause him to fall ill. And he will pass away in office, likely of what was a heart attack or stroke. And we know that when a president is unable to serve in office, the vice president will take over for him, and in this case, that vice president is Calvin Coolidge. So he will take over for Warren G. Harding, and he is the president, of course, mentioned in the activity you completed today in class. Alright, I know we did a lot, really just 3 main stories there, but if anything is confusing, please write it down and let me know, and we will go over any questions you have in class tomorrow. Okay? Hope you have a good day, and I'll see y'all tomorrow.